Can everybody hear me? That's great. Welcome to our virtual and in-person International Affairs Forum audience to the first event in our 2023 fall season. My name is Mike Leonard. Before I introduce our guest speaker and moderator, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Thank you. Our speaker will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. This year, we've introduced a change to the procedure. In the past, we'd look out over a sea of hands and pick several of you randomly. There's a couple of problems with that system. Those of you that know me know that I'm not smart enough to pick the best questions just that way. I'm not a mind reader. Secondly, because of the difference among speakers' voices, quite often online listeners were not able to hear the questions. So this year we're trying something different. We're going to be handing out cards. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Somebody will get a card to you with a pen. And you're encouraged to put your question on the card and hand it to one of our assistants. You can remain anonymous, or you can put your name on the card. If you're a student, talking to some of you back up there in the chief seats, thank you. If you are a student, please put student at the top of the card. Our reason for that is this is an educational institution, and we try to give voice to our students and our learners here. So please identify yourself if you're a student. If you're a part of our virtual audience, you can send us your questions at any point in the presentation, and we look forward to a terrific conversation tonight. For some time, we've wanted to present a program that examines the intersection between cybersecurity and its impact on democracy. Frankly, our challenge was to locate the right speaker. It's a complex topic, and it's often difficult to present in a coherent fashion. Fortunately, we've been able to locate that unicorn through the good offices of our British allies, and we discovered Alexander Evans. Alexander Evans' previous academic posts have included being the Henry Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress, a senior fellow at Yale, a Gwilym Gibbon Fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. He has a Ph.D. in politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London. He is a career diplomat. He has worked as an advisor to the Prime Minister at number 10 Downing Street, strategy director to the Cabinet Office, and cyber director in the Foreign Office. He has served as deputy and acting high commissioner to India and briefly Pakistan. He's led the United Nations Security Council expert group on Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, and been a senior advisor to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke in the U.S. Department of State. Dr. Evans was awarded an OBE for his work in Pakistan, where he led the UK's work on the tribal areas from 2007 to 2009. He has a Ph.D. in politics, he is a World Fellow at Yale and holds a BSc International Relations in the London School of Economics, where he teaches anticipatory policymaking and technology, data, science, and policy. His interlocutor tonight will be our own Jack Segal. Jack is a former senior U.S. diplomat and IAF board co-chair. He served at the National Security Council as Director for Non-proliferation and Export Controls from 1999 to 2000. Prior to that in Moscow, he was responsible for implementing a variety of arms control agreements. From 1986 to 87, he served as a State Department representative to the Strategic Weapons Talks of START, negotiations with the USSR in Geneva, where he drafted the Agreement on Nuclear Risk Reduction with the USSR, signed in 1987. The agreement continues to be honored by the U.S. and Russia today, despite the current state of the relationship. Please join me in welcoming Alexander Evans to the stage.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mike, and thanks to the Traverse City International Affairs Forum for having me here. I will try to speak slowly because I don't want to be misconstrued as an Australian. That's my key goal, okay? So it's a real pleasure to be here. I have family ties to Northern Michigan, so this is a very special place for me as well. And I've been asked to speak about can democracies win the cyber wars? And I think before I start talking about that subject, I just wanted to take us back to 1983. Now, that's just not just because 1983 was a great year, you know, I have many fond memories because I was alive. I was 9.5, I think, in 1983. But because there was an incident in 1983 in September that very nearly led to a global conflict. And some of you may well have heard about this before, in which a Soviet lieutenant colonel who was at one of the air monitoring stations tracking missile launches, his advanced warning system showed him that the United States had launched an intercontinental ballistic missile. The rules that he had were that his duty was to immediately report this to Moscow and report it up the chain. And against the Soviet nuclear doctrine at the time, the Soviet Union would have responded to that reported missile launch from the United States. And I suspect that we in this room would have not have been living in the world that we are living in today had that exchange taken place. The lieutenant colonel decided to ignore his orders and not report it up the chain. And that's why that incident didn't escalate. But there was an example of a system, a technology system, an early warning system that had a glitch in it, misreported an ICBM launch, and the consequences, as I mentioned, could have been very serious. I wanted to roll us forward to 2023. Imagine the complex scenario today in the event of a crisis of that kind. You're not just talking about one lieutenant colonel in one monitoring station. You're talking about a welter of different software systems, different strategic management systems. You're talking about multiple software systems on different machines. You're talking about a media environment that isn't just about cable TV and 24/7 news, but the cacophony of social media and commentary and the shrieks that we hear online. You're talking about a situation in which there could be a targeted effort by another state to misdirect and mislead the software systems and the information systems that are in play. And you're talking about a framework where, in the very near future, it's not inconceivable that we could be looking at a scenario where artificial intelligence may not be piloting the system, but it could be a very present and very real co-pilot in the system as well. So my main point of context here is arguing that we're living in a world that's very different to 1983, and a world in many ways that is more ripe with risk than 1983. And while we've learned a lot about systems and strategy and control since then, we're living in a world that is dominantly digital by default. Most people in the developed world, in North America, in Europe, in parts of Asia, are already consuming more than half of their consumption of words and information every day is through a phone or through a screen. It's digital, not analog. So we're already living in a world where basically the dominant strand of communication is digital. And the value at risk, which is a phrase used in the banking system to talk about how much value at risk is there in a portfolio that's invested. The value at risk for the United States, for the United Kingdom, for pretty much every country on this planet, is increasingly in that digital space. Our economies run on digital services and digital systems. Our national security depends on digital systems and software services. And our very way of life, our freedoms, our democracy, our ability to have voice depend on those systems as well. So the first point really is this sense that the level of vulnerability that we now have because of that dominantly digital space changes the conversation about the role of cyber and digital communications in the national interest. And it changes the dimension of international cross-border risk around cyber as well. And to that end, I wanted to perhaps take us on to the question, because I am a diplomat and an academic. Both diplomats and academics are quite well known for not answering questions. Okay? We're very good at talking, We're very good at changing the subject. We're not always great at answering the question. So I thought I might actually do something novel this evening and try to answer the question, which is, can democracies prevail? Can democracies win the cyber wars? And my answer is probably. Probably. But first of all, I should probably say what I think the cyber wars are, because I don't think it's just about a war between Russia and Ukraine, or a potential conflict between China and the United States that is the frame of reference here. It's also the hybrid conflicts, the gray zone conflicts that we've been seeing over the last 10, 15 years. Groups of hackers that are working as semi-autonomous agents for states. The use of disinformation as a weaponized tool to try and influence countries across borders. The use of technology dominance to change the balance of power between states. So hybrid is the second area, I would argue, of the cyber wars that we need to be thinking about. And the third area is the war for comparative advantage. And I'm not apologetic for using a term war on this, because we have moved very firmly from an era in the 1990s when we were reading Steven Pinker, worrying about Y2K, and looking forward to a world of ever-declining prices and ever greater optimism. Do we remember that? Wasn't it great? Didn't last long, did it? To a world today where great power competition has returned. That's the common golden thread that runs through the national security strategies, both of the United States and of the United Kingdom, where it's very clear that interstate war is with us for a while yet, against the predictions of people who thought we wouldn't be in the war business anymore. And just to give one sense, there are, according to a recent piece, at least 28 wars going on right now, and depending on your definition, it might be a much greater number than that. The war for competitive advantage is happening in lots of different ways. But it means that there is increasingly the securitization of economic policymaking. So what have we seen around that? Some things that used to be very firmly in the economy section of government, not in the national security section of government, have become more contested and are about global balances of power. Who controls the manufacturing of computer chips globally? Should we have most of that production anchored in Taiwan? Should there not be alternate spaces? Should there be production in the United States? Who should be the technology provider for our 5G telecoms networks? Should it be Chinese state-owned or state-influenced companies? Or should we be trying to protect some of that for companies that come from democratic states? So you've got this new debate now about how do we harden, if you like, how do we protect our economic interests, recognizing that everything is intertwined with everything. So national security connects to economics in ways that wasn't true 20 years ago. It was true in one dimension, you needed to have a good economy. And our way of life is tied into that digital structure around our economy and around our state as well. So these three forms of cyber war are areas that we should be considering as states and as governments. And the risk is very substantially different than it was before. I've talked already about the risk of strategic conflict and misperception and missignaling in that strategic conflict. As we all know from talking to family or friends, what we think we said last night is not necessarily what our family member heard us saying last night, right? I think that's something we could all recognize. Now, if misperception is a fact of life in terms of how human beings relate to each other, even human beings like husbands and wives or parents and children who spend an awful lot of time and know each other well, that misperception is amplified if you speak a different language, you come from a different culture, you might value certain reference points differently, and actually the translation of messages may not be as accurate as you think it is. In June, I had the pleasure of sitting in Amsterdam talking to Gorbachev's former interpreter at the Reykjavik summit in the 1980s. a Russian interpreter, and we ended up talking quite a lot about how do you interpret emotion? How do you interpret emotion? How do you interpret metaphor between English and Russian? How do you communicate intent? And yet communicating stories, intent, emotions is absolutely key to making sure that two protagonists, two countries that might go to war, properly understand each other. And that is complicated in a high-speed, high-pace, wired world like the one we live in now. We're obviously looking at a greater risk around cyber. One example is the cybercrime problem. I'm sure many of you know of stories of people who've been conned across the border by somebody exercising a cybercrime or a banking fraud push episode. It's an $8 trillion industry today, an $8 trillion industry. And it creates a problem, because if you have a crime that's committed by somebody in Michigan against somebody in Michigan, there's scope for action to be taken in Michigan. If you have a crime committed against somebody in Michigan that has been committed by somebody who's using a keyboard somewhere in Russia, that's a very different proposition to try and solve and tackle that criminal action. And cybercrime is just one dimension. So I guess I want to turn now to say, what do we need to do? And has government been doing anything about this in recent years anyway? So the first thing I do want to say is, honestly, bureaucrats haven't just been doing what bureaucrats sometimes do, which is sit in offices and talk to other bureaucrats. There has been concerted effort, both at a national level and at an international level amongst democracies, to figure out how to improve a government response to this. So one example has been to bolster the ability of intelligence and security services to identify who is responsible when there is a cyber or hacking incident. Because one of the first questions is, who did it? Who did it? Can you tell us with 100% confidence or 95% confidence who was responsible? Is this the Russians, or is this a group of teenagers sitting in Cedar, Michigan, trying to hack the system? And obviously, that has two very different consequences in policy choices, depending on who is responsible. So there's been a real improvement to the machinery of government to try and analyze and understand who is responsible for what. There's been an effort to develop new tools, new instruments to try and tackle some of this. So one has been to use attribution, to name and shame. So the United States, the UK, and other states have said, here is a hacking incident that was done across a border. It had real consequences. And we have published who was responsible, which country they were in, and guess what? Sometimes those folk have links to the governments of those countries as well. An awful lot of cross-border malign cyber activity emanates from the territory of the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, Iran, and North Korea. Not exclusively, but an awful lot of it does. So there's a very strong focus for many on the states from where a lot of this activity happens. There's been the development of a cyber sanctions regime. And there's been the development of an ability to conduct offensive cyber operations as well. Because playing defense is one thing. You need to be able to play offense as well. But the difference between the United States and UK capability on offensive cyber is we've said that we will be lawful. We will observe the rules of war in how we use that. And that is not a commitment that you hear from some of the other states, from some of those authoritarian states that have developed similar capabilities. I want to just turn to what do we need to do next. It's one thing if some of this has been done already, but what do we need to do to make sure that we strengthen and further the capability of democracies to prevail in these cyber conflicts, hopefully cyber conflicts that remain metaphors for conflict rather than hot wars. And I would argue that there's three particular things we need to think about. The first is we need to have a real sense of commitment and purpose. And purpose. This is not the thing that you fix between now and December 2023. This is basically an agenda which will require sustained effort for a decade and for decades. And that requires a fundamental rethink about the structures of government, about the capabilities within government, and about the plans to make sure that you've worked through what would you do in the incident. If something happens, what will you do? How do you exercise it? How do you plan your potential responses? The second issue is people. So it's all good and well to talk about, let's have a long-term strategy on some of this. By the way, long-term strategy, how good are we as human beings at long-term strategy? Yeah? Not very good, right? Did you ever think a year ago that you would be here today, this evening? Probably not. So long-range strategies don't come easily to human beings, and they certainly don't come easily to governments. Yeah, I've worked in government. Government is littered with many long-range plans, but don't necessarily become examples of long-range execution. But the people piece is also key, and the people gap is we need unicorns, and it's very generous of Mike to describe me as a unicorn. I'm not sure I'm a fully fledged unicorn, and I'm certainly not as wealthy as a unicorn. Those really rare unicorns out there who've made money. But we are going to need a bundle of people who can't just code and hack and understand the infrastructure of technology around the world. But we also need people who can understand how to govern, how to supervise cyber risk, how to think about deterrence in a world where cyber is now part of the equation for interstate conflict. And we need people who, if you like, can understand all that, but also communicate it in plain English, or as some people like to say, in plain American. Yeah? Because it's one thing to have the deep specialists on some of this, but if they can't translate it so that the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense can understand it properly, it can't effectively impact on strategic decision-making at the top of government. And the third thing we need to think about is investment. Now, this is obviously a real shock. Former bureaucrat stands up and says we need more money to support bureaucrats to do things to protect our national security. Have you heard this story before? But when I say we need investment, it's not necessarily about putting all that investment on the federal government or the national government side. But we need to invest in cybersecurity. Because cybersecurity is a growing problem across our economies. And that's how do you protect the intellectual property of a company based in Traverse City, Michigan? How do you make sure that the Munson healthcare system doesn't get hacked and has systems that are up to date and sufficient? How do you make sure that the private data of students at NMC can be protected? And this is where the private sector role is probably actually much more important than government. It's how do we get the right people on boards? How do we have the right people in executive teams? Because cyber isn't something that's just for the person who's the coder in the corner or the chief technology officer in the organization. It's something that's going to affect us all and where we're all going to need to have a level of literacy around it as well. And finally, it wouldn't be right if I didn't talk about partners. I'm talking about partners not to do a special plea for Britain, although we are a really nice country. It rains a bit more than it rains in Traverse City, but we don't have the same lake effect weather. But partners, because the reality is that this is not an agenda where any single country is going to be able to do it alone. If you're thinking about the levels of investment we need around industrial strategy, the levels of coordination to make sure that we work collectively across democracies, this is an area where working with international partners is going to be key. And it doesn't necessarily mean giving up sovereignty to do that. It means burden sharing. The reality is that working together, we're able to do much more than we can do working separately. It also means those partnerships with the private sector. There may be getting people to come into government for spells and help us out. And finally, it's going to be on a subject that may seem really boring, which is standards. Standards. Because if we're thinking about next as well as now, we need to be thinking about VHS versus Betamax. Students, don't worry. I know it's scary when you hear that. It's a reference, it's a 1980s reference, but for people in the room, there'll be a range of people who recognize it. So for people who remember the standards war between Betamax, which was a better quality product than VHS videotapes. You had basically, the VHS won the video standard in the 1980s. And the world was filled with VHS video recorders and cassettes. Back in the 1980s and the 1990s, we could be pretty sure that the standards for technology were set by American companies or friendly democratic countries, shaped by lawyers, lawyers in practice or in universities across democracies. And whoever was going to win, it was going to be the Western variant that would win, not a non-Western variant. That is not true today. We're in a much more contested world where actually autocratic states, state-owned companies are going to shape that standards debate. So if we're thinking about what do we need to do for 10, 15, 20 years hence, we need to be paying a lot of attention to standards. It can be dull, it can be very technical, but it won't be boring if it means that we lose weight and competitive advantage against autocracies in 15 or 20 years' time. So I'll stop there, but I hope I persuaded you that we should be pretty anxious, but we should also be pretty positive. I understand in Michigan there is a town called Hell as well as a town called Paradise. And I think Traverse City feels like it's sort of somewhere in between the two, right? So I think when we think about this, it's also important not to engage our panic button immediately. You'll notice I haven't mentioned, really, artificial intelligence, because I think there's a lot of known unknowns about artificial intelligence right now. But I think that's another, obviously, big theme that we're going to have to factor in terms of conflict as we go forward. So thank you very much for having me. And I'm going to invite Jack to come up.
Brilliant. And he had an amazing amount of information on that one little piece of paper. I just flabbergasted. Welcome indeed to Traverse City and to this International Affairs Forum. We will be getting questions from the audience, and we will be collecting those, and I'm sure they will be terrific questions, and we'll be starting to distribute cards at the appropriate moment. When you were discussing the second part of your presentation about what to do, it caused me to think about something you said earlier today about how, or actually it was earlier in a presentation you gave, where by being so digitally connected, we are digitally vulnerable in so many ways that we weren't before. We've learned a lot. We've heard terms like dark web, or ransomware, or Stuxnet, or malware, or ChatGPT, and we all have varying understandings of what those terms mean. But what does come across to me is that basically because we're so connected, everything can be hacked. So what is the defense mechanism that, before we get to the international level, well, what can people do to defend themselves? What are the steps that they should be taking individually?
So thanks very much, and Jack, great to be here. And I pay tribute, I think, to both you and Karen for the role that you've played in making the International Affairs Forum a thing. But look, and one of it is a statement of the blindingly obvious, which is cyber hygiene. Cyber hygiene, yeah? Which is a little bit of, that is changing your passwords, installing patches, not using password 123456, which may sound like a joke, but actually it turns out Britain's National Cyber Security Centre, which is part of our GCHQ intelligence agency, it's the agency designed to protect our cyber infrastructure in the UK, finds that actually that password is still significantly in use by a range of individuals in the UK. And they publish every year a list of the most ridiculous passwords that are still being used by people. So cyber hygiene is really important here. And that's something that everybody can do, not just government. And it's really important for small and medium-sized enterprises, for small businesses. If you're a service business, if you're generating something that has value, there's a risk there. And I recognize that's also hard, because asking small businesses to spend more money is tough. And asking people to spend more money on security is tough. Asking people to change our passwords, not so tough.
It's hard to do, but yes.
Hard to do.
But that, that does raises the issue of there's a cost that's coming to everyone from this deluge of attempts to scam people, to penetrate their software and their devices. And we seem to be oblivious to that. People put things on their phone, including like passwords and things like that, and assume that they're okay, but they're not. They're vulnerable. So you really have to segregate out what security measures you're taking and make sure those are not online. Is there a magic bullet here? Do some companies sell a sort of a generic, you have one password and then they keep all of your other passwords for you? Is that an effective tool, or is that an easy one to hack into?
So look, password management is a thing one can do. I think there's a difference between what criminals can hack into and what states, with their resources, what hostile governments can potentially do. So in reality, if a hostile government wants to break into your email and read what you sent to your cousin last week, they're probably going to do it. Yeah? But that doesn't mean that a group of hackers sitting in downstate Michigan can necessarily do the same thing. I'm conscious, Jack, that there's a huge sticker shock attached to lots of this. Are we really going to have to pay this on security? Cybersecurity feels, for a lot of people, like a second-order issue. That's the thing you do after you pay for your mortgage and your car and the gas and your food and so on. But if basically you run the risk of losing a bundle of that because of cyber attacks, then it's legitimate to spend a bit more money. The bigger challenge, I think, is the potential bill for government. We have got used to paying effectively Walmart prices for our defense budgets since the 1990s, and we're not living in a world as positive as the 1990s anymore. So I think there's an interesting question for what are we going to need to invest in defense for our respective countries. And there's a good challenge question for European states, including the UK, which is we have taken great store by the value and the generosity of the United States to provide for defense for the world. Are we going to need to pony up a bit more cash to pay our way? And I think it's a pretty reasonable argument that we should all be investing more in defense, but that includes America's allies, who traditionally haven't necessarily spent as much on defense as we could.
Well, that's interesting. That raises the question of, well, why should the United States assume that we're the best at this? We're the best at everything. We know that already. But are there other countries that we should be emulating, or that should be in the lead of this? Is Finland better, or is Estonia better at this? And we should be, looking to them for more guidance, for clues. Or is it something as big as the United Nations?
Well, look, I don't know a great deal about American sports, so this is a very dangerous intervention in this room, okay? But I'm gonna reach for college basketball, right? It's fast, it's messy, yeah? But every team is a product of the members of a team, and they bring different strengths to that play. And I think the US clearly is in a pole position on lots of issues around technology, cyber, defense, artificial intelligence, and innovation. But there are also other countries that do good things too, and may have specialist opportunities in particular spaces. I do think there's something here about unleashing investment into the companies that can do some of this in the future. Now, does that money have to come from government? Maybe that money can come from a private sector. Mm-hmm. But we're going to need a lot more innovation. We're going to need to run to stand still, because we don't have the dominance and the advantage that we enjoyed either during the Cold War or particularly in the 1990s.
Well, earlier you raised an interesting question of when there is a penetration of a system, the first question you would have is who did it? and it might be from Cedar or it might be from St. Petersburg. And that in itself can be a very complicated question to try to answer. So you're already at a kind of a disadvantage if it's not a state actor. If it's coming out of a transmitter in Moscow or in Pyongyang, it's maybe a little simpler. But if you can establish who did it, then your next logical question would be, what am I going to do about it? And if the answer is, well, it's some unidentifiable computer hack in St. Petersburg, what can you do about it? So you really have to talk about, well, what defenses do I have? And what are there defenses? You've worked on a UK approach to cybersecurity. Maybe you could tell us how that works.
Well, look, the first thing you do need to do is I think it's certainly helpful, and both the US and the UK now have dedicated agencies to look at cyber defense. So having it across, an agency within government that can do that is important. I think it's important to have, think about what are the tools that you can use to respond under those circumstances. But a lot of that response is a little bit like a police or judicial response after a crime. The crime still happened. So you're not fixing the crime, you're trying to respond to the crime to find justice, but also ideally prevent the next incident. I would argue that some of these public attributions, so the naming and shaming, can be helpful. Because actually, if often the people doing the hacking don't work for governments directly. They're people who are contractors. And if you're a contractor and you have a reputation as a really excellent hacker who can do a lot of magical things, it's pretty shaming to suddenly find your name, your photograph, and a picture of your office up on the internet somewhere. That basically says you're pretty incompetent. So there are ways, I think there are tools that are available that can be helpful on some of this by way of response. But crucially, it's also going to be important to recognize there might be an attack involving cyber that is of sufficient scale where it's an act of war. And and it's important for countries not to define what that would be externally, because you don't want to define a limit, a red line. In a way, it's like having a 6-year-old child. If you say to the 6-year-old, you can watch TV, but only if you don't do this, they will do everything they can possibly do just short of that line, right? So strategic ambiguity, not being very clear, is our friend in lots of this policy making.
Well, this suggests then a sort of, let's agree internationally on some rules of the road. I've worked in arms control, and you have too, and you're dealing with an adversary who doesn't want to give away an advantage, but both of you need to find a spot where you both benefit from it. So even, let's leave off North Korea for the moment, but the other bad guys on your list might have a mutual interest in saying, this is out of bounds. This kind of activity, like shutting down hospitals or hacking into nuclear power plants, we can't allow that to happen in our own country. We can't allow our citizens to do that. Is there any mechanism now that exists to create that group of possibilities and to say these are off bounds, out of bounds?
So there is a lot of work going on in the United Nations to try and think about what might be the rules or the norms that would shape behavior on this. And I was involved in some of that. I was in the committee of 25 experts appointed by the Secretary General to make recommendations on it. And I was in the best perfectly formed committee you can join, a committee of 193. Try planning your weekend activity on that basis. But that's every single country in the UN system, an open-ended working group. I can promise you it's very open-ended. But both of those mechanisms were trying to look at, what about norms? Are there potential ways forward? There are some people who argue for a digital Geneva Convention. We need a new rule of, we need basically a new global framework to govern this. Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, has argued for that. My former Russian counterpart, Andrei Krutsky, also argued for it. The Russians love a good treaty and a good rule. The challenge would be, would we have confidence that some states would actually follow those rules? They'd love to create a rule book, and they'd love to make sure we follow it. But would they follow it themselves? So there's an interesting debate to be had around, where might we want to pursue a treaty on this, and where is it better to find kind of forms of agreement short of a treaty? There is one exception at the moment. There is a negotiation already underway on a cybercrime treaty internationally. And that's actually an area where most states could probably agree, because actually there is a common interest in tackling cybercrime. So there is scope for international cooperation on that basis.
Well, this is President Reagan or Maggie Thatcher would agree, the famous phrase, trust but verify. So because you go back to that problem, you don't even know where that hacker is located, really. And they're very good at disguising their location or where they're even working from. So this is, the verification side of this is going to be extremely complex and difficult, unless it becomes such a bad problem for everybody that we all say we've got to do something about this.
Well, and Jack, there's also a proliferation problem, which is that this kind of technology used to be available to governments that invested lots of money in it. But nowadays, there's lots of companies that will provide these services to governments. So there's kind of like an Uber economy on this globally. If you're a small or medium-sized country with a neighbor you really don't like, and you want to have the ability to hack into their systems, there's a company that will happily provide a service on that basis. So there's also a risk here that we see lots of countries gain capabilities in this space at a pace that is much faster than, for example, some of the proliferations of technologies before.
Just to mention to the audience, there's a new podcast on National Public Radio called Click This. Click This. And it just started up today, but it's actually been online for quite a while. And there's an interesting story about they hire a Dutch policeman who's at the end of his career. And he's kind of the one outsider. Everybody else is young, dynamic, and computer experts. And he keeps saying to them, fine, but without evidence, you don't have a conviction. Without paperwork, you don't have a conviction. And getting that evidence of crime is going to be an enormously complicated challenge. On the other hand, they were discussing what you alluded to once in your presentation, which was cyber attack, a cyber offensive capability. So maybe you could describe how that might work. What would you do? What would cause you to attack or counterattack, and how would you counterattack?
I think all I'd say on that, perhaps to bring it to a close, would be I think it's important for countries to have the capability to use cyber as part of attack, offense as well as defense. It also makes sense to not necessarily talk about what your offensive strategy is going to be, just like any good coach.
Okay. All right, but I could imagine you suffer an attack like our hospitals are attacked. And then you go back to the source and you say, well, we're going to turn the lights out in your capital city unless you get those people who did that and prosecute them or grab them, get them out of business. It could get into that kind of exchanges.
Absolutely, and there is this debate about, it's called hackback. When would it be legitimate to hack back against attackers?
Yeah.
But part of a risk we're managing here is an escalation risk. How do you make sure that something doesn't escalate unduly? And that is why I always find generals to be very good at managing escalation risk. And I'm peering across at our general over there, Mike.
Well, this is the time for our audience to get involved. So we're going to try the card system tonight, so I'm encouraging all of you to write down your terrific questions, pass them to our helpers. We're going to take while we're doing that, we're going to take the first question, however, from our virtual audience. And this questioner reminded us that this is an educational institution, and you talked a little bit about cyber hygiene and the fact that it's incumbent upon all of us to practice good cyber hygiene. Is there training and education on both sides of the pond, both at the high school, perhaps even grade school, college and university level, that should be taught, that is not being taught?
So thanks very much for that question. It's a really big theme and it's an important one, which is, there's going to be a real challenge to roll out cyber literacy, certainly for teens. I think there's a very strong argument for preteens as well, under many circumstances. And while recognizing that some things have changed, many of my students are pretty comfortable with trading services on their phone for privacy. They're pretty comfortable with that. So there is a slightly different approach generationally to some of the trade-offs between services and apps and privacy and security. But I do think there's something really important here when it comes to finance, when it comes to privacy, and when it comes to your digital trail. I am very relieved that everything I did as a 17-year-old is lost in the mists of time. I'm very relieved about that. And when I have discovered small batches of photographs kept by my parents, I engaged in full destruction mode to make sure there's no record, right? That is not true of people today because of the digital trail. So there's, I think one of the interesting policy challenges, not just for kids and for teens, but for adults as well, is we are now going to live in a world of digital persistence where every single mistake, every single harsh word will be recorded forever. And what does that mean for how do we allow people to make mistakes and be forgiven and move on? I'm not talking about the really big mistakes where you need to go to jail. That's different. I'm talking about the kind of everyday, normal mistakes that young people make and adults make, and where we probably ought to have some space for reintegration into life thereafter.
Okay. This is a question from a student. His name is Jose. During the Obama administration, in whose State Department you worked, drone warfare was significantly expanded. It's a two-part question. What were the reasons behind this expansion, and what role will the continuing modernization of the physical battlefield have in cyber warfare?
So thank you very much for that question. And look, the whole world of drone warfare is key. I think one of the real drivers of drone warfare during the counterterrorism period, so thinking about the 20 years after 9/11, has been that drones allowed you to do things, allowed you to reach into and understand and take action against terrorists without the same risk to your personnel as sending in special forces, and without the same risks that might be attached diplomatically to working across the border. So clearly drones have become part of, were normalized, as it were, in many ways through counterterrorism. There is an active and reasonable debate about when should they be used? When should lethal attacks be used? Who has the right to do that? Is it fair to do that across borders? What would happen if people start arguing, I have somebody I really don't like in northern Michigan, and I'm going to take them out? Yeah, that becomes a real challenge and an issue. But I think the challenge looking forward is what a colleague of mine in London has called warbots. Yeah? He's written a book on warbots, which is what's the challenge in an era when we might be looking at weaponized drones at scale. We're already seeing that in the Ukraine conflict, the use of drones on both sides. But in a world where we might have a significant volume of low-cost drones, do we end up with a situation where some of the high-tech, high-cost investments we made in defense, aircraft carriers, for example, suddenly look like a very different type of investment to when we first engaged in them? So it's another argument, Mike, I would say, for making sure that part of this military modernization is we need to be able to integrate that kind of capability into our armed forces, into our ability to defend our countries, but also to take military action elsewhere when we need to.
Well, it's an important point, though, that it doesn't have to be additive. You don't have to increase your defense budget to redirect it in a more logical position. If we can say, well, why do we still have 12 aircraft carriers? and I'm sure there are Navy people out here throwing things at me right now, but why do we have all those nuclear weapons? There are lots of ways you could ask the question and say, well, why don't we redirect some of the trillions of dollars that are going into these new weapon systems into things that are really more close to home and more perhaps equally dangerous?
And that's a very reasonable comment, Jack. I mean, I guess one of the challenges at the moment is we're in a world where we seem to need a lot of artillery shells, and we also need a lot of drones. So, you know, there are demands coming in different directions. I decided partly to become a diplomat because I realized I wasn't smart enough to do military procurement.
I'm going to combine two questions here, one from Karen Segal, who I believe Jack knows, and another from a student, and I think they both asked pretty much the same question. Karen asked, returning to where you started with the 83 example of the lieutenant colonel who overrode the false alarm, could you think about another event in 83, the Soviet shoot down of the Korean liner 007, because the Soviet pilot believed it to be a US spy plane? In this case, could AI have played more of a role, and could it have overruled the personal bias of a human being to demonstrate the actual facts? And the student, Madeline, thank you, Madeline, articulates the same thing in a different fashion. Are there benefits that could actually help with democratic relations as a consequence of cyber and improved communications that might actually be beneficial to us today?
Well, thank you both. And you know, look, AI, I think, does have a lot of potential in this space. The best explanation I've heard from a colleague on it was from an academic who works on criminal justice in Chicago. And he said this, look, AI basically will allow you, if you think you're a judge, for example, or you're a drone operator. I was talking last night to a 787 pilot about the same issue. If you're one of those things, the only thing you know, even if you're deeply experienced and very senior, is every landing you've ever done in that 787, or every time you've flown a drone, or every judgment you've made as a judge. AI and big data allows you to extend that to every single time a 787 has ever landed, every single judgment that has ever been made on that crime, in that type of crime in your court. And it exposes some things about the inaccuracy and the unreliability of human judgment. I'll give an example. Does anybody in this room suffer from being hangry at times? Yeah, hangry? If you haven't heard of being hangry, it's the combination effect of being hungry and angry, right? The two are connected. So it turns out one of the most interesting pieces of research on judicial decision-making, which was done, you know, where there's an interest in using AI to help code decision-making. So the judge still makes a decision, but the AI helps the judge. It turns out that if you go up for a parole decision in a court just before a judge has had lunch, you don't get the same outcome as if you go up for a parole decision at 9:30 in the morning. So there's, you know, I think there are ways in which AI can help make better decisions. Whether it would have helped with that terrible incident of the shooting down of that jet is debatable. One of the interesting things about that case study, again from the 1980s, is the exchange between the Soviet pilots, the two Soviet pilots who scrambled, and then ultimately one of those pilots shot down that civilian passenger jet. And they were arguing with each other, and they were arguing with ground control, and there was a lot of swearing. Yeah? So in the heat of conflict, sometimes people make good decisions. Sometimes people make bad decisions. And ultimately, would we want to let go of humans making decisions about killing other humans? Because that's a pretty big decision to make, either for one human being, yet alone in a conflict where you might be choosing to kill many human beings.
I hate to interrupt, but I have to put a plug in here. There is a piece of legislation in Congress right now to forbid the use of artificial intelligence for decision-making related to the use of nuclear weapons. That piece of legislation will not pass unless Congress hears from you that that's an important thing that you don't want to see happen. that we don't want, we want the human to be in the loop when decisions about nuclear weapons use are made.
And what a segue into this next question. Bridget, another student, asked the question, do you believe that the action needed to protect against cyber warfare can truly be taken and carried out consistently within the political disarray today?
Politics. This is a very dangerous question for a recovering diplomat. Yeah? When I was at Yale, somebody in the business school was trying to teach courses on CEIs. A CEI is a career-ending incident. Right? So I need to avoid a CEI in whatever I say in answer to this question. But look, politics is tricky in lots of our countries. There's not a lot of bipartisanship. It's difficult to find points of agreement. But I would argue that across administrations, both in the UK and in other democratic countries, there's quite a lot of consensus around the long-range challenges of technology and cyber. So you've seen actually consistency even in the US government on this. There was a consistent support from both Democrats and Republicans for the Department of State to set up a bureau on cyber and emerging technologies, a key bit of changing the institutional machinery and architecture in the State Department. There's bipartisan support for strengthening some of the capabilities within the Department of Defense and within the intelligence community in the United States. So I think there is possibility of bipartisanship on this. I understand it was quite a good idea for Britain to get out of the business of telling America what to do. Apparently that wasn't very popular when we did it. So I'm not proposing to suggest that again now. But I do think, it's back to my point that long-range purpose, long-range planning, this is going to be the work of a generation. It's not going to be the work of a single administration. And that's part of a challenge we face right now.
Okay. We have another question here from a student. Somebody must have passed the word that either the student questions come to the top, and so everybody's writing student on the top, or we've got some very, very engaged students tonight, so that's terrific. Shannon asked the question, do you see the enforcement of global cyber war restrictions and limits as an issue? How is the UN or some new global organization going to see their laws are followed and prosecute criminals in criminal networks when, of course, obviously national sovereignty is also always an issue?
Well, look, national sovereignty is pretty key because, let's face it, we don't have democracy unless we have sovereignty. Yeah? You cannot have a democracy unless you have sovereignty. And I think for a while in the 1990s, it became a little bit fashionable to get, sovereignty wasn't a subject that people talked about that much. I think it's pretty key. And again, whether you are left-wing or right-wing, sovereignty is pretty essential to protecting a democratic way of life. I think the challenge at a global level is trying to get 193 countries to agree on a single framework for this, trying to bridge that gap between autocracies, who are very interested in digital technology, but to control their peoples, not to enable them, and democracies who want to use technology to allow innovation and free ideas and freedom of expression to flourish. It's a challenge. I do think there is some space around norms. Now, you might say, what is a norm? I'll give an example. If you visit London, and I hope some of you have, and I hope many of you who haven't would consider doing so, like Traverse City, I don't always recommend going in February. But if you go to London, it's very difficult to get British people to speak to you because we're not always a very social group of people. But you're guaranteed to get a British person to talk to you if you stand on the wrong side of the escalator in the tube system. Okay? So it's not a law to stand on the right in the British tube system, but my goodness, it's a norm, right? Everybody does it. And if you're a foreign visitor, you learn pretty quickly that you're going to do that too. So norms can be really powerful and have an effect. Laws sometimes don't have an effect. We have a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in most parts of London. It is not observed. Okay? So that's a good example where a norm, and I think we can probably think of parallels in all of our lives, right? There are some norms which people will follow, and some laws that people don't respect and don't particularly follow. So in thinking about the international framework, both laws and norms can be helpful to us, but we need to work out when and where and how. And crucially, Mike, we need to work out which countries are not going to play by those rules or norms at all, because some won't.
There's been a lot of talk about the gerontocracy in our own political system here on this side of the Atlantic. And the question, of course, comes up as to whether the folks that are making our laws really understand the impact of cybersecurity. And it's the impression, according to this writer, that we may be lagging behind Europe. Are there new leaders that are emerging that we need to be paying attention to in terms of nations that are getting it right?
So I always think it's more complex than one country. One country is #1, and this country is a laggard on it. On the generational difference, I think it's not just about older leaders; it's also about middle-aged leaders as well. I gave a talk in Connecticut in April, and one of the things that was asked of the audience, mainly younger people, mainly teens, and mainly it was a mix of high school students and college students. Was where do you principally get your news from? And 95% of them said that they got their news from TikTok. Yeah, now that is a different world to my world. Yeah, so I think there's a little bit of recognition that actually every generation changes a bit, and just because you are technologically, just because you're a digital native, as it said, somebody who's grown up entirely in that online world, which is not true of my generation, it doesn't mean you're necessarily much smarter about cybersecurity or cyber risk. You're just much more of a super user of some of those tools and systems. But for me, it comes back to this issue that this is a tier one risk, and it's a tier 1 issue. It means that everybody should be thinking about it, but it's a board level issue. It's a C-suite level issue. It's a national level issue. It's an international issue. And that's why that level of attention needs to be focused on it.
Okay. We have one final question from our virtual community, and it says, what do you think is the effect of drone warfare, other than the investment in aircraft, et cetera, given that a drone attack is more easily carried out without the same investment in personal conscience regarding the effects of that attack? I think the question is how is drone warfare and other cyber warfare changing the way we do business? Probably a question they should have asked me, but I don't want to answer it, so.
Well, look, I'm not a warrior like Mike. I'm a diplomat. I talk and occasionally listen for a living. But there's an element here which is, I think, if I heard the question rightly, about the ethics around it. Does it feel different if you're using a mouse rather than flying a plane and you use lethal force? It seems that some of the evidence on that shows that actually drone pilots have just the same levels of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder from conducting out lethal attacks as pilots who are sitting in the cockpit. And if anything, drone pilots are often closer because they can actually see the person who is killed in a way that sometimes pilots of traditional manned aviation couldn't in the same way. So I think the ethical dimension is a really important question. Does it feel more remote? Are you going to make different kind of ethical decisions about the use of force? The bigger question for me is one about how do we make sure we are training individuals making those decisions? How do we do the ethical decisions around those decisions? What's the framework and the doctrine we develop on some of this? Because there is a question further down the line. At the moment, we use forms of technology, but it's always with a human hand on the tiller. Would we enter into a world of warfare where we are effectively allowing machines to make independent decisions themselves about killing people in the battlefield? And when that moment comes, it's a very different operating space for warfare.
Absolutely. Well, that's a wrap for what should be the first of a very terrific fall season. Please join me in thanking Alexander and Jack for a compelling and lucid description of the problems and the opportunities that face us in the brave new world of cyberspace. So our next event will be on October 5th at 6:30 p.m. Yes, we are going to work hard to get back to our Thursday evenings. This was an exceptional event tonight. We're going to be joined on the 5th of October by Ambassador Susan Page. The topic will be Africa, permanent crisis, ? Ambassador Page is the director of the Weiser Diplomacy Center and professor of practice in international diplomacy at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. She was the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, U.S. Ambassador to South Sudan, charged the affairs to the African Union, and Ambassador Page will bring a unique perspective to a very challenging part of the planet. We hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you aren't a member of the International Affairs Forum, please join. If you are already a member, thank you for your support. And until we meet again, be well, be safe, and go forth and do great things. Thank you.